Thank you very much, Anna, for your kind introduction, and Hanna and Sven for your invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. Is this loud enough? Very good. Yes, I'm really pleased to be here, and I appreciate a lot this idea of a laboratory, or of a space where we actually share approaches and work, rather in the idea of working together than of complete, finished presentation. So my presentation is not written. It may be a little bit bumpy from time to time. You will see that. But I thought I will try to do a kind of navigate in a different manner, different projects that I have been involved in the past 10, 15 years, and bring them together around this idea of life and death at the threshold of the museum collection. My title is in a way misleading, because actually there won't be any B in the presentation. There will be quite a lot of bugs and a lot of beyond. So you will see where it takes us. As Anna said, this is not moving. Do you know why it doesn't react to me? I just clicked on it. That's better. I've been working in the past 4 years, 3.5 years in the frame of this research project, Reconnecting Objects, on a research that was focusing on chemical modernity and the way how it was present in museum collections with colonial history. And we've been working with this like partly on my own and partly in collaborations with artists. One of them I show here. So on the side of the group, I'm part of this group with masks. The other side is Sybille Gouvet-Andemagnan, so one of the artists I've really worked with in the frame of this project. I will less speak about this collaboration today. I regret a bit after the discussion we had yesterday, because I think in terms of methodology and sharing questions of conservation, it would have probably brought something to our discussion, but maybe we can come to it in a more formal, informal way afterwards. I wanted to start with this image that is two images that are actually taken from the film Wild Relatives by the Palestinian artist Jumana Mana that we just translated in the frame of our online journal Troubles dans les collections. Jumana in this film contrasts different types of relating to heritage. In this case, she looks at seed vaults. She looks at the way how seed banks actually put seeds into a void space with this idea to keep them for the doomsday, for the day after the catastrophe. And so to take them out of these living environments where they actually evolve in interaction with other species in a context. We talked a lot about context yesterday. That is always changing, and that is always implying human and non-human agents. And she contrasts to this idea of finally, also capitalist space where there is a valorization of the seeds, a normalization of the seeds. She contrasts the activity of organic pharma in Lebanon, who is trying on this war-ridden territory to plant species on soils that he's cultivating. And there's this incredible, beautiful scene where he is digging with his hand in the soil and takes a hand of the soil and looks at the worms that are moving in this hand. And he says, Jumana, look, great expectations. And so I think if we think about what conservation, transmission, transformation can be like in human and non-human worlds, it would be a starting point that is generative for me to take. Very quickly and in contrast, I wanted to jump through a couple of images of spaces in museums. So here we are in a storage space described by theorist Fernando Dominguez Rubio as an object-sustaining environment, so as an environment that is actually providing resources, hygrometry, packaging, classification that is there to maintain objects in a non-transformed state. If we look at the museum as a space, like not the storage space, but the exhibition space, we can see a similar approach here. The Brussels-based artist Pauline Havsiam-Barek actually commented on the way how museum spaces create distance between the visitors and the objects that are approached mainly through one sense, which is the sense of the gaze. And here you have a couple of devices like the rope that is revolting that become actually agents in a space where most of the time they are passive elements in a kind of organization of the space where you have to keep the absence. Life in most of museums is present as formal life, kept in fluids, in herbaria, in entomological drawers, and in showcases. So as a documentation of something that was living before it came to the museum. And artists have worked on this question, as here the French, Canadian, Tanzanian artist Kabwani Kiwanga, who was invited for an exhibition at La Joliette Museum in Canada, where she actually proposed to work on the way how the museum was built on expropriated territory from native communities that were based there before. And so she proposed to bring the soil of this place into the museum, to make this gesture to actually invite the very soil on which the museum was built into the museum, and to provide showels to the visitors and to invite them shovel by shovel to carry it back to the place from which it was taken, which is left a kind of scar in the garden of the museum. And so there was this reparative gesture to work on this scar and on the circulation of the soil. And what actually happened is that she, in order to have the right to bring the soil into the museum, she literally had to kill it. She had to expose it to heating, to strong heating, in order to make sure that there was nothing living organically in it. And so this is a kind of relationship that I'm a lot interested in, and that ultimately took me to this question of chemical modernity, of this relationship between keeping and erasing that this modern context takes us to in a lot of regards. We look here at ein Chemieschrank, so a place where chemicals are kept in a museum. And just take this image to introduce a very small hint to an article that we've written with a conservator, Ariane Thévenoud, and just published online, spreading the scientific approach, the chemical turn in conservation from the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro to colonial museums in the French Empire. That traces actually the history of the introduction in the Ethnographic Museum du Trocadéro in French of a fumigation chamber, une étuve toxique, in the 1930s by Adrien Fedorovsky, who was in charge of the establishment of an approach to conservation that was opposed to the idea to pursue conservation as something that was spontaneous and driven by the ethnologists, but that was meant to become scientific and organized in that way. And so chemical treatments were part in that scientific reorganization here with a plan of the weekly chargings of this fumigation chamber where the totality of the collection was exposed to substances. So we found in the archives a lot of documentation of what were the chemicals, where were they ordered. And so one of the interesting questions, maybe also for the nature culture questions that we ask here in the laboratory, is that many of these chemicals are actually shared between agriculture and museums. Also, in a way, between the war industry, which is another preoccupying aspect, and they leave a lot of traces in museums. So if you dig into this question, you will see a lot of these colored nitrile gloves that actually lead conservators today to conduct their profession with a lot of protective devices, because they know that they engage and interact with chemicals that can affect their health. This politics did not only deploy in Europe, but it also was exported to the colonies, and so became part of the organization of conservation in places like here, the Institut Fondamental de l'Afrique Noire à Dakar, au Senegal, where you have an organization of the fluid collection, informal, pretty close to what we just saw from the Berlin Natural History Museum, and also the leftovers of chemical conservation with these very visible, very present naphthalene balls that are present, and that they're so aggressive that they're even eating the wood that the collection objects are presented on, or the objects themselves. Here again, we found documentation of the products that have been used in this context. Insects in these contexts are most of the time present as objectified insects. So they are presented in showcases, classified in hierarchies, put as something interesting to study, and a wealth coming from history, scientific history of the classification of nature, or they are addressed as a problem. As here in the multiple campaigns on pest management in museums and the different manners to approach this question. There are several authors that have been important for me in the past years in thinking critically about this concept of pests and denaturalizing this conception. So how the idea of pest actually grew as a scientific and political construct that an author like Sarah Jansen shows has been at the crossroads of political ambitions and scientific research. So she focuses on the 19th and early 20th century and retraces, which for me is always very interesting, the case of a bug that was characterized as a French bug that came to eat the German forest in the context of the preparation of the First World War. So a whole part of also an identification of these insects as nationalized and as a threat, as a foreign threat that is coming. And like she takes this research until the Shoah and until the conception, like the vocabulary of insects in the talk around eradication, which is something that I think we can find again in the Rwandan genocide and in other cases. In this same line, Melchen, in their book on animacies, speak on what they call animacy hierarchies as, and here I quote, the way in which sexuality, gender, and race are shaped by the social divisions between the animate and inanimate, the human and the animal, male and female. So, and Chen shows how these animacy hierarchies place the human subjects, mostly adult, able-bodied, and male, at the top of this classificatory hierarchy, and then the non-human sentient animals followed by non-sentient objects. And so insects are somewhere quite low in this hierarchy. Artist Sami Baloji, who is a Congolese artist with whom I worked a lot in the past decades, was interested in the way how chasing insects became a part of the colonial control of the territory. And so he proposed in this work, Essay on Urban Planning from 2015, a modernist grid structure that opposes two views. One, the views on entomological collections that actually come from the Tervuren Museum close to Brussels, that documents or is full of species, objects, documentation from the Congo. And at the other hand, aerial views from the city of Lubumbashi that you see here divided by this green strip in the middle. And this green strip in the middle is actually a remnant from colonial times, because the theory of the Belgians was that the mosquitoes and the flies couldn't fly further than the width of this strip. And so that actually the European neighborhoods would be protected from maladie, from diseases, thank you, of the African neighborhoods by this strip in the middle of the city. At the same moment, so in the end of the 20s, workers, colonized workers in Lubumbashi were obliged to bring 50 flies a day in order to get their food. So as part of the same politics described by Olivier Lecourt Grandmaison as l'empire des hygiénistes, pointing to the role that tropical medicine has in the control of the territory. And with this, I jump back, so I won't go into detail into these questions, to the connection between entomology, chemical control of collections, and colonial racism and hygienist discourse that we find again in the speech of Adrien Fedorovsky, so the staff I was referring to, who installed this fumigation chamber in the Met in Paris. And he actually writes in his small book, Collections Coming from the Colonies and Collected from the Natives, who most often live in deplorable hygienic conditions that represent sometimes a danger for the staff in charge of studying, manipulating these collections, are henceforth subjected to disinfection. So also part of this, same idea. Before leaving the theoretical part and coming back to the artist, I just wanted to bring in a very recent book by Malcolm Ferdinand, who is a Martinican researcher, wrote that book on decolonial ecology and just published S'aimer la terre, défaire l'habité colonial, in which one chapter, quite inspired by Vinciane Dupré, actually takes a point of view so he studied a lot the employment of a specific chemical compound called chlordécone on the banana plantations in Martinique. And so here he actually proposes to turn the gaze around and to think like a weevil as a way of pulling back the modern veil, of bringing to light the continuities between the treatment inflicted on these non-humans and the violence suffered by humans, and of considering the weevil not only as a mirror of the future of humans, but also a being with whom humans inhabit the land. So what would that actually mean as a practice, and how do artists, and maybe prior to what Malcolm writes, have adopted these approaches? I jump back to the National Museum of Lubumbashi in the eastern part of the Congo, where actually biennial takes place, the Lubumbashi Biennial, and I was part of the curatorial team of the public program 3 years ago in 2022, where an artist from Angola, Pamina Sebastio, was interested in the entomological collection. And what they actually did was to to look at this intersection of classification and of something liberatory in the rereading that they proposed in the collection. So Pamina developed, at the one hand, a kind of kaleidoscopic video of her own body replicating like an insect, and at the other hand, these site-specific drawings that actually show the process of, do you say in English, chrysalid? So the transformation from worm to chrysalis. Yeah, okay. I knew that I wouldn't say it rightly. And so their conception, I think, resonates quite a lot with the Mel Chen book I referred to earlier on, because they say it requires to deconstruct shame and rejection that we have toward our body's nudity, to kill the body that one inhabits, and to strive to find the possibility of a new one to rise. So it considers these entomological collections as taking part in a logic of hierarchization, of submission, and of normalization that are actually life-threatening and requiring to go beyond this this organization of hostile bodies. So insects in this idea become allies, and become allies in in this work that we also find in an approach conducted by Candice Lin, who's a Los Angeles-based artist with whom I worked on an exhibition in 2017, and who here, inspired by Franz Kafka, but also Lynn Margulis, proposes this huge, like human-sized insect lying on a bed and becoming, at the same time, a human figure and a figure that is proposing, an identification with body replicating in a different manner than humans. But the main work I want to speak about is this porcelain chamber that she constructed out of unfired porcelain in Paris in 2017 in an exhibition titled A Hard White Body, that was looking into the colonial history of porcelain, and that actually she left in the space for 4 months, keeping it wet with a mixture of water from the Seine and urine from the visitors of the exhibition. And actually this keeping wet the space led to the fact that a lot of things happened. So molds arrived, spiders arrived, lichen arrived. It was cracking, it was very odorant, people were complaining. There was a question of, can the art space actually go on working like it did before with all these living processes in the air. So very interesting negotiations around that. Before the exhibition traveled to Frankfurt, it had to be fired because otherwise it couldn't have been transported. So the reference to water was rather in the color, in the light of the space. But what she did for this chapter that was called A Hard White Body, a Soft White Worm, was to introduce silkworms that were actually eating part of the drawings and mulberry leaves installed on this hard fragments of the porcelain chamber, and so introducing the questions of the condition of a body that is way more fragile in order to survive in these spaces. And the last chapter of the exhibition took all this material and us to Chicago in 2018, a hard white body, a porous slip that in this case at the Logan Center referred to the colonial exhibition of Chicago in 1893. Like celebrating the anniversary of Columbus. And what Candice did here, and I think this is interesting for our discussion, is to put everything in a water pool and to actually look at what happens to the material. So the idea of the gallerist to sell parts of the drawing afterwards was gone with a practice where actually the entropic transformation of the material led to a totalization of this porous slip. I jump a little bit back in time to a project conducted by French Guyanese artist Mathieu Clélier-Aboninck, who was interested in the collection or the scientific activity of his grandfather, who worked for Institut Pasteur in the first half of the 20th century. And beyond taking objects back to France and to the French colonial collections, he also named insects, and so notably a mosquito that would then carry his name. And so Mathieu was interested in this double gesture of putting one's own name on a species, so which is part of this like classificatory scientific approach, but at the same time to create a parent, which in this case is a parent that can kill you because it is a mosquito that transmits potentially deadly diseases. And so in this project that was interrogating the colony as a setting or as a place of fantasy and paranoia, of desire jostling against fear and loathing, there is a kind of encounter with alterity that was inhabited by the insect, and that Mathieu conducted further by bringing, smuggling in his drinking bottle larvae from these mosquitoes to the European Union, which is obviously forbidden, and which in the frame of climate change will probably come back as a different kind of discussion right now. And so the exhibition, this was in the frame of the Berlin Biennial 2014, where these larvae were actually developing in the water. We did a book out of that, Crawling Doubles, Colonial Collecting and Affect, and this idea of affect was taken further in a film that Mathieu developed, and an essay I wrote around this idea of phobia, of the rejection of this kind of strong, effective reaction to insects as something that David Trotter calls an ineradicable permeability, and a way, a sign. I had somewhere the quote here. He asked if being phobic is a way to be modern, so a way to actually translate through this strong reaction of the phobic subject, a separation of spaces that are not recognized officially, but that come back through affects. I just show this image from his film that he actually presented in this case. I won't speak about it in detail. this is not where I wanted to continue. I changed that. Okay, we'll jump that part and finish on a conception that maybe is less exclusionist and rather looks at a kind of cohabitation and co-evolution. Insects in living insects in museum spaces are considered in this book by Marie-Lou Florian as cosmopolitan species, but what is most interesting is that she looks at the way how they become dependent on people and their lifestyle. So they are evolving with the conditions of the museum. And museums in their IPMs, in their integrated pest management steps of the past years have developed forms that are rather less in the chemical repression and rather in a kind of tracing of the presence of these insects that you can see in thresholds like this glue threshold, traps, pheromone traps, or also the cultivation of the presence of insects in laboratories, like here the Röntgen laboratory at in Berlin, where actually a museum biologist is cultivating museum bugs in order to study their behavior. And on this, I want to finish with an exhibition, another exhibition that I worked on, and the film doesn't work. Well, c'est pas grave. So you could normally hear a little sound, a little something that is eating, and you don't really know what it is, but now I cannot move on anymore. Voila, an exhibition titled Mollusma by artist Elvia Tiotsky that she did at La Criée in Rennes in 2021. And that comes from this Greek term of the stain, mollusma is stain, and that was proposed as what preceded by a marine biologist, Maurice Fontaine, and preceded the term of the Anthropocene. So the idea that human waste regimes change lastingly environments. And Elvia, who is a trained agricultural engineer and an artist, started to work on algae that proliferated as a consequence of the employment of chemical fertilizers in the agricultural industry in Brittany. And so these algues vertes are well known because they actually led to the deaths of numerous animals and at least one human. And so ask this question of the unplanned effects of industrial agriculture and chemical compounds in these. And so Elvia proposed to a group of volunteers to transform these algae into bricks. Yeah, so sometimes it's so easy. So, and these bricks actually were transformed into small housings, and in these small housings, she introduced grasshoppers. And these grasshoppers were a kind of speculative proposition that dealt differently with the question of proteins, so in a other approach than the one of pig, this huge pig industry that is present in Brittany. But also questions of cohabitation, because it meant for audiences like us that we actually had to evolve in a space where these grasshoppers were moving around and inducing a different relationship to the bodies, but also to the relationship. So, for example, the person who was in charge of the public, the audience, was phobic to insects. And so we had to work with this. It was a very interesting exhibition. And the grasshoppers finished by eating one of the other artworks, which is this print of the field that Elvia showed, that is entirely covered up with plastic sheet in order to allow the plants underneath to grow quicker. But obviously this is part of the petrol industry. And she printed it with eatable ink on eatable paper. And the grasshoppers were quite happy about that and lived on this artwork for the rest of the exhibition. And I think with this image, I will stop and leave the question of conservation to this gesture of snacking grasshoppers.
Yes. So thank you so much for that introduction and also for having me here. It's really a privilege. And I heard already so many inspiring, interesting things. Oh, some echo. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I want to start with a short reading. Bear with me on that. It is the year 802,701 AD. Where once was London, the time traveler from Wells's famous 1895 novel finds a large museum. And I quote, I observed far off in the direction of 19th century Banstead a vast green structure, different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was larger than the largest of palaces or ruins I knew, and the facade had an oriental look, the face of it having the luster as well as the pale green tint, a kind of bluish green of a certain type of Chinese porcelain. The material of the palace proved on examination to be indeed porcelain, and along the face of it I saw an inscription in some unknown character. Within the big valves of the door, which were open and broken, we found, instead of the customary hall, a long gallery lit by many side windows. I perceived, standing strange and gaunt in the center of the hall, what was clearly the lower part of a huge skeleton. I recognized by the oblique feet that it was some extinct creature after the fashion of the megatherium. The skull and the upper bones lay beside it in the thick dust, and in one place where rainwater had dropped through a leak in the roof, the thing itself had been worn away. Further in the gallery was the huge skeleton barrel of a brontosaurus. My museum hypothesis was confirmed. Going towards the side, I found what appeared to be sloping shelves, and clearing away the thick dust, I found the old familiar glass cases of our own time. But they must have been airtight, to judge from the fair preservation of some of their contents. Clearly, we stood among the ruins of some latter-day South Kensington. Here, apparently, was the paleontological section, and a very splendid array of fossils it must have been, though the inevitable process of decay that had been staved off for a time and had, through the extinction of bacteria and fungi, lost 99/100 of its force, was nevertheless, with extreme sureness, if with extreme slowness, at work again upon all its treasures. The place was very silent. The thick dust deadened our footsteps. And at first, I was so much surprised by this ancient monument of an intellectual age that I gave no thought to the possibilities it presented. Even my preoccupation about the time machine receded a little from my mind. Now I still think that for this box of matches to have escaped the wear of time for immemorial years was a most strange, as for me it was a most fortunate thing. Yet, oddly enough, I found a far unlikelier substance, and that was camphor. I found it in a sealed jar that by chance, I suppose, had been really hermetically sealed. I fancied at first that it was paraffin wax and smashed the glass accordingly, but the odor of camphor was unmistakable. In the universal decay, this volatile substance had chanced to survive, perhaps through many thousands of centuries. End of this reading. This is my own voice again. So it may not be surprising that for Wells, also known as the father of the field of future studies, the museum is where his fictional time traveler stumbles onto a recognizable array of enduring human-made artifacts. Today, the museum remains an institutionalized site of encounter with objects that are sometimes hundreds or thousands of years old. From paintings that have kept their color since the 13th century to ancient ceramic pots and golden relics that have survived ruin and vandals. Indeed, historians have long documented how conservation and restoration practices became institutionalized in Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Practices that partly determine which art and heritage, and also, of course, nature, are maintained, deemed to have value, and represent the past that matter. In this domain, the question of durability has long been dominated by histories of collection, preservation, and repair. But what of the initial impulse to make things last? How did artisans explore durability as a making practice in the first place? And why did their patrons want to own long-lasting objects? It's these questions that lie at the heart of my current research project on the history of durability in art. And I just also want to say that in the past few years that I've been working on this project, I've had the privilege of working with this amazing team as well. One PhD candidates just finished, and the postdoc, Grace Kim Butler, she just left the project in the fall. So at the moment, it's just me and Henrike left on the project, but it's been a real privilege to have sort of a team to sort of think about these issues. Durare attends to a longer history of durability in art, which predates the 18th century paradigm of looking back. It is, in fact, a history of looking forward and imagining the futures in which art objects would remain beyond a single lifetime. It considers the history of durability in art through, one, the social practices pertaining to the acquisition of art, such as the cultural desire to create and maintain legacies. It considers the making of art, such as the exploration and manipulation of materials to make them resistant to change. And the owning of art, including the evaluation of the physical environments in which the objects will be kept. Indeed, long before the birth of the museum, which institutionalized durability as one of its main ambitions, art was marked by other histories of durability. These lie in its materials, in its making, and in the ideas about how and why materials and techniques may contribute to an object's ability to last. These practices add up to what I would like to call the artisanal cultivation of anticipation, through which I argue Western Europeans learn to imagine and, importantly also, make objects for distant futures spanning multiple generations and into the hundreds and thousands of years. An artisan may craft a tool, such as a hammer, with an eye toward making it last the course of their career. However, an artisan's material techniques to create, for example, a multi-generational legacy for their patron creates a rich basis for understanding the nature of historical forecasting and their possible implications for our present ideas about the future, especially in relation to the conservation of nature. Durare therefore considered what comes before conservation and underpins it. It's about that what was thought gives something the best chance to be long-lasting. Whether it really lasted or not is a different question. To show a few aspects of what the artisanal cultivation of anticipation proposed here might entail, this paper today focuses on artistic ideas and explorations of durability in the case of glass and nuclear waste. Two substances that, as we will see, have become intricately bound together through notions of material durability, containment, and toxicity on long timescales, towards the end of times even. Let's first turn to glass and the problem of durability. Ideas about the potential lastingness of glass can be found across time and across continents. We have already seen that by the end of the 19th century, Wells, as time traveler, associates glass with its potential to durably contain certain substances when he talks about display cases keeping their contents preserved and glass vials even being able to keep volatile substance such as camphor for, well, hundreds, thousands of centuries. Until, of course, the time traveler smashes it to reveal its contents. Indeed, glass, despite its potential material durability, is culturally fragile. If it's not properly cared for, glass objects are unlikely to survive to the year 802-701 AD in one piece. Of the many ancient perfume bottles that survive until this day, while not even close to 800,000 years old, not one of them still has its delicate or even volatile contents preserved. In most instances, their stoppers are lost, and most flasks were likely only preserved through serendipity. Many come from archaeological digs, preserved by virtue of being protected by layers of earth. But some glass artifacts have survived below ground or in other forms of containment because of established cultural practices. The realization that glass can be incredibly long-lasting when it is kept contained or protected is certainly ancient. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, considered glass for this reason an excellent material to provide the deaf with eternal vision, such as can be seen here in the glass eyes of Shabti of Amenhotep III, and which were made some 3,500 years ago. In more recent times, Western treatises on art theory and artistic technique also point towards the special durability of glass when kept under the right conditions. Giorgio Vasari, in the technical treatise preceding the biographies of his 16th century Vita, brings up the durability of glass on several occasions. In the chapter on stained glass windows, Vasari discusses the special ability of stained glass to resist damage from the weather. We learn that the Flemings and French are masters of this art and discovered how to burn in the colors that are put on the glass so that wind, air, and rain may do them no injury. Vasari explains that in former times, windows were sometimes also painted in colors coated with gum and other temperas, but they wasted away through time and were carried off by the winds, mists and rains, till nothing was left but the mere color of the glass. But despite its ability to resist the weather, Vasari also points towards the inherent breakability of glass windows when he explains that to protect them from boys and other nuisances, a fine network of copper wire was installed behind them. He concludes with the pertinent remark that these works, if they were not, were not for the too fragile material, would last in the world an infinite time. This, according to Vasari at least, was the case with the art of mosaic, about which he is certain that it is the most durable picture that exists. He continues that other painting fades through time, but mosaic continually brightens with age. Other paintings fails and waste away, while mosaic, on account of its long life, may almost be called eternal. For its special durability, Vasari considers the art of mosaic particularly suitable for creating long-lasting legacies. For this reason, that is its durability, we perceive in mosaic not only the perfection of the old masters, but also of the ancients. A little over a century later, Jean Adiquet de Blancourt, a Parisian genealogist, takes such ideas about the longevity of glass even further. Adiquet de Blancourt believed that glassmaking was the ultimate art because of its material durability. In his treatise, L'Art de la Vieillerie, this confidence in the stability of glass leads Blancourt to make a remarkable claim about the end of the world, which he believes will turn it to glass. Blancourt states that for, and I quote, the general conflagration in reducing the earth into ashes by reason of the vast quantities of salts that are mixed with it, would at last vitrify the whole mass into a lasting monument of the art, that is, the art of glass. According to Blancourt, such an ending befits a world well stocked with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of the materials for glass, that is, sand and salt. The divine fire of the Last Judgment thus transforms the whole world into an everlasting shrine for glassmaking by becoming glass itself. Blancourt imagines this as a process of moral and chemical metamorphosis that will alter the world into something immutable, or in his words, changed into a better nature, afterwards to be inhabited by a new world of spiritual, incorruptible, and glorious nature, no more to be subjected to any change. As inspiration, Blancourt may have drawn from translations of the Florentine priest Antonio Neri's glassmaking treatise L'Art de Vitraria, in which Neri remarks on the widespread distribution and abundance of the raw materials for glass. God, he writes, made the matter of which glass is compounded, a thing so needful and profitable to man, so abounding in every place and region, which with much ease may be everywhere made. This note in particular inspires at least a comment from Christopher Merritt, whose 1662 English translation of Neri's treatise was especially popular. In his comment, Merritt recalls an artist who once stated that the profession of glassmaking would be the last in the world. For when God should consume with fire the universe, that then all things therein would vitrify and turn to glass. As long as there is a proportionable mixture of salts and sand or stone that make up the earth, so the logic went at least, God would literally create the end of the world in glass. Whether our world will turn into glass when it reaches its end, we do not yet know. We haven't gotten there just yet. But it is interesting to mention so-called Libyan desert glass in this context. This glass was created by a huge impact over 30 million years ago. Perhaps a meteorite impact or a meteoritic aerial blast, which would have caused temperatures around 1700 degrees Celsius. That's warmer than the interior of a volcano, and formed at higher temperature than any igneous rock on Earth. Due to this heat, the sand of the Libyan desert turned into glass without requiring flux. In glassmaking, fluxes are used to lower the high melting point of silica, and Libyan desert glass does not contain any such additives. It is nearly pure silica. No one other than King Tutankhamun took Libyan desert glass into his grave, shaped into a scarab, symbolizing eternal life. Even though the ancient Egyptians certainly did not know, or at least likely did not know, about the true origins of this material, it did become associated with longevity and immortality through its application in their burial rites. From the Libyan desert glass created by natural forces over 30 million years ago, we can move with surprising ease to its man-made counterpart. What you see on the slide here is trinitite, also known as atomsite or Alamogordo glass. It is the glassy residue that was left on the desert floor after a plutonium-based nuclear bomb test on July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. This glass is primarily composed of the arcosic sand found at the location of the blast, a type of sandstone that is rich in feldspar. The majority of the glass is bottle green in color, but a red variety is found in the northern quadrant of the test site. This anthropogenic glass, caused by the extreme heat released from the nuclear blast, may indeed be quite similar to the Libyan desert glass, which some geologists believe was also caused by radiative melting. Trinitite glass is also radioactive, something which was not known before the location became a site where people enthusiastically sourced this material to sell and transform it into jewelry. While much of the trinitite is therefore gone, authorities have tried to bury whatever is left on the descent. Warning signs have now been put up stating that it is illegal to take the atomic glass, which weirdly is actually also necessary because apparently ants keep digging up the pieces of glass, the pieces of trinitite, and so they keep resurfacing. And I don't know what happens to the ants now, but that's another story. So to continue from the ants, radioactive materials are everywhere in nature. Rocks, soil, and our bodies contain radioactive substances. But unlike these natural radioactive materials, only man-made radioactive materials, and especially the waste thereof, is harmful to the environment. Humans cannot see radiation, they cannot smell it, and they cannot hear it. In their Nobel lecture, read in 1905 by Pierre Curie, because Marie Curie was sick at the time, quite likely from the toxic materials they were both frequently handling, the Curies addressed the double-sided coin of their discovery, the radium rays. They are a treatment for a disease, as well as a substance that is toxic to humans and could be used for criminal purposes, that is, to make weapons. And I quote from their lecture. Radium rays have been used in the treatment of certain diseases, lupus, cancer, nervous diseases. In certain cases, their action may become dangerous. If one leaves a wooden or cardboard box containing a small glass ampulla with several centigrams of a radium salt in one's pocket for a few hours, one will feel absolutely nothing. But 15 days afterwards, a redness will appear on the epidermis, and then a sore which will be very difficult to heal. A more prolonged action could lead to paralysis and death. Radium must be transported in a thick box of lead. In the form of an ampulla, glass was thus able to contain the radioactive material, but it was not able to protect humans from its harmful rays. All the same, glass would come to play a fundamental role in nuclear waste containment. Nuclear waste is so long-lasting that it has the potential to release toxic elements into the environment for thousands of years. To contain it, therefore, means finding a material with a similar longevity, or to transform nuclear waste into something that is long-lasting but without the release of toxic elements. As a result, the logic with which we deal with nuclear waste is one of durability. How is nuclear waste itself durable? And how do we keep it safe for the what could be considered almost unforeseeable future? One of the solutions that has been actively explored since the 1970s is to use glass or ceramics to transform nuclear waste itself into a stable vitreous substance and accordingly dispose of it in deep 200 to 1,000 meters geological repositories. Significantly, it's the long-term survival of cultural artifacts made of glass, some for thousands of years, that has made them the subject of research for this type of nuclear waste containment. There are interesting parallels with the historical examples discussed earlier. We have seen that glass has a long reputation and association as a durable material, something strong enough to keep the weather out of a building, yet maybe not a soccer ball from a young boy. suitable for the afterlife, stable enough to contain volatile substances, and especially in the case of mosaics, glass was considered the best material for leaving a legacy. Blancourt went as far as to consider the end of the world as a time in which the earth would become stable, that is durable, an unchanging monument of glass because of the divine fire that would transform it. As a popular grave good, glass has indeed been one of the oldest surviving anthropogenic materials. And it is exactly this long survival of man-made glass objects from many centuries ago, sometimes thousands of years old, that has made glass a fundamental material in nuclear waste research. Scientists studying ancient man-made glass because it provides them, and I quote from this article, with a rich source of analogues to study long-term mechanisms of glass change for the design of new glasses for nuclear waste storage. Here, the question of timescales, and particularly what timescales are deemed to matter, crops up again. The ancient glass of, and I quote again, the bauxite, which is where they, the type of glass that they studied was from this site, is valuable because researchers know what happened to the glass, how old it is, and how it has worn. This can help them improve their models for long-term environmental protection. And I quote again, we need relevant timescales. Research parameters of durability does not only make explicit timescales for durability that matter, but also build out the timescales of research itself. Long-term experiments with replicas of historical glasses, so these researchers used Roman glass, medieval glass, and 17th century glass, are meant to further study the potential durability of these vitreous substances under controlled conditions. So they're actually burying it underground, and it's the next generation of material scientists and chemists that will dig it up again and study it. So the research itself is actually is long-term. But similar to Curie's ampulla with radioactive matter, nuclear waste contained in a glass matrix is, however long-lasting and stable this matrix may be, is still harmful to humans and the environment if we put it into contact with it. The glass merely helps to keep the waste stably contained in one place. The waste, however, is still toxic. Nuclear waste as glass therefore also requires space, along with the relevant social cultural practices that help manage this space to durably contain this toxic substance. It is such notions of durability, care, and accessibility that various contemporary artists have put at the center of their work. In response to the 2011 nuclear disaster that took place in Fukushima and which displaced more than 24,000 people, the Japanese collective Chimpom installed an inaccessible exhibition in the nuclear exclusion zone in 2015. But while the exhibition has been installed, it has not been opened and will likely not be opened in our lifetime. One of the artists in the exhibition is Trevor Paglen. Paglen exhibits a sculpture called Trinity Cube, a cube made of trinitides, indeed the radioactive glass produced by the 1945 Trinity nuclear bomb test in New Mexico. Paglen fused it with glass from broken irradiated windows found at the exclusion zone to create the jewel-like cube shown on the slide. So here we have glass produced during the explosion of the first atomic bomb, fused together with shattered and irradiated glass from the Fukushima exclusion zone disaster in an exhibition that can likely not be visited during any of our lifetimes. According to the artist's website, the artwork will be viewable by the public when the exclusion zone opens again, any time between 3 and 30,000 years from the present. Talking about a permanent exhibition is an understatement here. The American artist Darren Simmons plays with similar ideas concerning material durability and long time scales through the vitrification of toxic waste. Siemens has worked with the Russian State Atomic Energy Corporation to repurpose nuclear waste into an art object that can be stored in a contained form. Black Square 17 is composed of medium-level long-term nuclear waste containing organic liquids, inorganic liquids, slurries, and chemical dust from a nuclear plant in Kursk. It also contains materials from pharmaceutical and chemical plants in the greater Moscow region. This nuclear waste has been vitrified into the shape of a black square. Inside of this black square is a letter to the future. Essentially, Black Square 17 is a toxic time capsule. The vitrified nuclear art is stored in a steel container with reinforced concrete at a radon nuclear waste disposal plant outside of Moscow. Only when its radioactive properties have diminished to levels deemed safe for human exposure and exhibition, approximately 1,000 years after its creation, will the object be installed in the Garage Museum of Moscow. The artist themselves says, I wanted to produce a work of art that was not for my generation, nor my children's generation, nor my children's children's generation, but for the distant future that I couldn't even imagine. Well, in the time traveler's future, the museum and its glassware appear to have survived by chance, but certainly helped by the museal context of durable preservation. Siemens makes the durable containment of her piece a concrete ambition and a problem of the institution that decides to keep it. This poses entirely new questions to the future owner of this art. What kind of safekeeping is required for art that is toxic for thousands of years? And who, in fact, are the beholders of an art object which cannot be physically engaged with? At least not immediately after its creation. And in 1,000 years from now, will the Garage Museum of Art even still exist? And what about a storage facility aimed at keeping and containing nuclear waste until then? And what will be the nature of the audience perceiving this piece? And can this future audience even perceive this piece? Are they humans or other creatures entirely? Siemens pushes traditional museal ambitions to the extreme here. The question is no longer, keep the art object durable for as long as possible, but here is my extremely durable and toxic work of art. It has to be kept contained for 1,000 years until it can safely be displayed. Indeed, more than the Moscow Garage Museum of Art, it is in fact a nuclear waste facility that is taking care of this art object. In some cases, this happens more structurally as well. The Central Organization for Radioactive Waste in the Netherlands, for instance, argues on its website that its storage facility was not only designed by the artist William Verstraeten, it's actually painted a shade lighter when the waste becomes less toxic, but it also states that Kovra understands the art of preservation. And I quote from their site, "The storage building for low-level and intermediate-level radioactivity is protected and has a controlled climate. In actual fact, everything that a depot needs. For this reason, Kovra has made the space that is unusable for the storage of waste available to the Zeeland museums. For the coming 100 years, the storage building will also function as a museum depot with various objects of art displayed between the containers of radioactive waste." I think it's also really important to realize here that art is used as a rhetoric of safety here, of course. If this place is safe enough to put artworks between the waste containers, then that says something maybe about this place. The desire for the durable, I argued at the beginning of this talk, led to an artisanal cultivation of anticipation that developed over many centuries. It was very prominent in the West, though certainly not exclusive to it, but as a result certainly shaped the pillars of the institutions that keep and care for cultural heritage today. To conclude finally, artists, I think especially, have a long history of experience thinking across generations, and with considering what it means for their objects to survive or not. I would like to argue that there are similarities to today's challenges in having to imagine the concept of sustainability. Sustainability or durability are evidently not just about materials or just about technologies. They are about drawing out connections to our environment. Who's using the environment? Who's living in this environment? The history of durability in arts is therefore pertinently not about keeping things indefinitely, but about critically examining where the imaginaries for making things that last come from, at what timescales they were conceived of, and importantly, how they can be operationalized for present collaborations. It's these themes that I hope to think along with all of you during the remainder of this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Is the microphone good still? Yes. Does anyone have any questions to kick us off?
Thanks very much, Marjolein. It's fascinating as ever. I wonder about this history of durability and that idea of durability. I mean, the way you tell, especially with the glass containers, and so these ideas, these philosophies of vitrification, etc., behind it, it seems to be all about immortality, stability, and permanence. And at the same time, there's a sort of counter history, especially associated with glass, which is really about fragility and mortality, etc. And so I wonder how that translates to this idea of durability, whether there's sort of, yeah. But the mic is not on in this room. Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder whether there's sort of alternative histories. I mean, histories of alternative ideas of durability, which actually allow for change, etc., also present.
Yeah, it's not working, right? Or no, so it's kind of like right. So it is working. Okay. I, I understand. Yeah. So a notion of durability, sort of that encompasses change as well. I think so. When I started out this project, what I got interested in was sort of this fixation, I think in Western art history, precisely with stability in a material sense, and in sort of freezing objects in time, even maybe being able to go back in time to a previous state of an object. And so I was just curious about what underpinned that kind of thinking, so to say. And from other projects, I had done a lot of sort of research on and seen a lot of recipes for making stable stuff and long-lasting stuff. And I think what I realized, I mean, of course, there's also been a lot of improvement, and there are wonderful projects about that, and you could do many more wonderful projects about that. But what I would really love to do, and I would invite everyone, hopefully, to think with me on that, is to take this concept of lastingness and move it to other cultural practices. Because there are many examples where durability is not conceived of then as a material thing, but for instance, as a practice. And well, my favorite example is always the Ise shrines in Japan, which for hundreds of years are being rebuilt every 20 years. And so there is a generational aspect. The fact that the temples are still there is because every 20 years a new generation sort of like knows how to make them. So there, I think for me, that's an example of where durability in practice is valued over durability of stuff. And that's sort of like a trajectory along which I would like to think more. And I think it also we had yesterday in our circle, thinking about expertise and practice. And so maybe also how these notions, how we can think through materials and practice and see how they influence our thinking about durability. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That has been really fascinating, and I've learned such a great deal. I would like to take you up on this idea of timescales and relevant timescales. It came all over again through your talk, and actually also, you know, kind of connect with Sven's question and with your answer. As you know, my interests are, or many of us here that work on the more ephemeral part of, let's say, contemporary art. Our interests are in performance, choreographies, and events, you know, this kind of short durational events. And I wonder how durability features there. I mean, partially you answer that by providing this, you know, idea of is a shrine through the kind of ritual, right, through time, right? There are also quite many different, the so-called intangible heritage, whatever traditions that could be called upon, or yeah, like, you know, contemporary artworks, performance-based works, and so on. So on the one hand, I'm interested in the short kind of temporal scale. And not extraplanetary has been already addressed, and I wonder what are we thinking when we are thinking this time horizons, you know, in terms of durability, whether there is a way for us also in conceiving of this project further, or thinking this project further, to ask this question: what kind of time are we thinking about, you know, when we address durability or conservation of nature culture?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I think you already in part answered your own question, because I think everything you said sort of really resounded with me. But I think also in terms of the timescales, what I find really interesting, if you sort of look at this long history of thinking, and also, and I presented the case of glass, but you can go through different crafts in thinking about this. Then you see sometimes really short time scales, like, maybe in the case of wood, for instance, it has to be free from worms, to connect a little bit to the previous talks. It has to be free from worms so that it will at least last 30 years. So it is like a kind of a very concrete, one generational sort of thinking for an object to last. I think what I was fascinated about was also how someone in, for instance, the 16th century or the 17th century would conceive of eternity, or thousands of years, or make a promise, as we know, for instance, Dupré did for one of his paintings, like, oh, this is so well done, it will last for 500 years, and if you let me apply the special varnish, like 100 years more, 600 years. For me, it was really interesting to think like how someone in the 16th century would conceive of 600 years. Because if I try to do this, I get nowhere. I mean, if I try to think 600 years into the future, I don't really know what's happening then or what's going on then. So I think what for me would be really stimulating also, maybe as something we could do together, is like, what timescales make sense? Like when we think of this, the problem of sustainability, which was very important also in our discussion yesterday, and of course comes up in art and nature conservation discussions, then timescales and the thinking in timescales, there's also authorities defining these and defining how many years we're supposed to think in the future and what matters there. And I think there's an influence to be had, as in our fields, I think we are equipped to think with time. And so maybe we can actually have a voice there. So, but I don't know yet what voice that would be. So that's also maybe something we can all think about.
The three over here.
Thank you very much. It was so fascinating to listen to you, but I'm also tempted to draw a line to climate change and to the first talk we had yesterday. Glass is also a factor that enables to create climate conditions like greenhouses or aquariums, and to deal or to design ecosystems. So to translocate nature, like it enables to grow pineapples in England or so. Did you also work on that, or it's not so much about durability, it's maybe more about ability to use glass? What is your opinion in this?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's a wonderful question. I think sort of in the form of enclosure and containment and artificial environments and transposing the environments to wherever you want. Yeah, glass is so fundamental. And so that's a very interesting topic I'm also thinking through. I think the other one of glass itself, being this incredibly polluting substance to the environment, is also important, and I didn't mention it at all. I listened to a podcast, and it was someone talking on biomimetics, which is a huge field in material science, and she said, and it really resonated with me, I think the invention of fire is highly overrated. And then she explained what she meant by that, in that it kind of is causing a lot of the destruction that's happening to our planet today. So the fire is at the root of a lot of pollution and destruction. And then she said, if only we were to turn to nature and look how ceramics are produced cold, like without fire, and sort of take it from there, we would really sort of solve like a huge part of the climate crisis. And then she referred to kind of a sea creature that produces a typical kind of shell that's harder than ceramics that are fired, and it's produced completely from its surroundings in the seawater and everything that's there. And so she said sort of we have to and I know also actually on the African continent there are practices of making bricks by cold methods that don't require fire either. And so I think also the history of glass connected to the history of fire is maybe one that we have to turn away from and like see if glass can maybe also be another substance that doesn't not require fire. But that, of course, yeah, requires also a lot, I think, of cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural, even cross-animalistic collaboration. Because, yeah, we would really have to look at all these different spheres of cold glass, basically.
Yeah. Have 5 left. You kind of saw these two first, so I'll go in the order of.
Okay, thank you very much for this incredible and so inspiring talk. I was intrigued by this idea of the somatics that you mentioned in relation to the human perception or not perception of the atomic waste. And this idea of feeling absolutely nothing that is also related to the engagement that we can have with the non-human or more than human world. And also I was trying to connect that with the examples that you show about this contemporary collective artist and other about the long lasting and this idea of not for this generation, but for others. So I want to ask you how you combine like this kind of the urgency or necessity of transform of our perception in this world of climate breakdown and so on, and how these artistic practices like try to address also these changes or yes, transformation of perception that we need. So something related to somatics and human perception. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That's again such a great question. So I'm always really fan of sort of trying to think what assumptions we have about things. And they often have to do with our own senses, you know, our own way we can perceive the world and remember the world. And so I think that's really entwined with all these ideas of durability, you know, even at the time traveler having this ampolla that's maybe 800,000 years old with camphor in it, which is, yeah, kind of unimaginable, but he could only smell it until he crushed the file and then he knew what it was, basically, and it was so recognizable to him. And I think in how we're thinking about the future, we're thinking very much, you know, of course, in this anthropocentric sort of way through our own senses, because, well, it's really hard to do otherwise. But it would be an interesting experiment to try to, you know, imagine like even this letter on the inside of this black box. Can someone even read it? Is it even a script that someone can understand? If there's different creatures finding it, do they even have eyes or a sense of touch or all of that? So this takes it a little bit maybe to the sci-fi level. But on the other hand, I think it's important because to think like that, you kind of undermine your own perceptions about, literally, about your own sort of, yeah, as you beautifully said, somatic experiences in the world. So maybe we all have to try to be mollusks during this workshop or worms or... yeah, and then think about conservation like that.
Okay, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the Nature Culture Lab team for these amazing workshops. Many thoughts and ideas have been developed and unfolded yesterday and today that I think make possible to envision some alternatives to rethinking conservation other than human agencies, and in some way a sort of a post-anthropocentric conception of heritage, conservation, aesthetics, and so on. So I clarify that I am not an expert in conservation, but as was said in my introduction, an art historian with a background in philosophy and curatorial studies. I am currently working in the intersection between environmental humanities and art history and theory, new materialisms and multinaturalism, focusing in aesthetic practices in Latin America, particularly those that take place in ancestral indigenous territories like the so-called Amazonia, Patagonia, Gran Chaco, between others. One of my main arguments relied in exposing the micropolitics behind material infrastructures of art practices from an ethical and political perspective, and also the formulation of a non-modern aesthetics that I think is taking place in many sites where contemporary art in the intersection between nature cultures has been developed. So this is like a short introduction about my actual research concerns, and I briefly want to mention that this presentation here is related to a current project that I am developing within the Inherit Center together with Margareta von Oswald and Joanna Kim that is called Muddy Measures with Wetlands and Heritage Converse. This project is a collaborative initiative that explores scales and methods of documenting and making relations with wetlands, such as scientific metrics, artworks, or indigenous perspectives that emphasize rituals and their relationship with water. We focus on 3 geographical areas: Berlin, Brandenburg, Moor, Patagonian Majin or wetlands, and Sura Tilda Flakes in Korea. As measurement is central to both heritage and wetlands, whether in attributing value, defining an endangered species, or justifying conservation efforts, this project engage with both dominant approaches and alternative ways to engage with these environments that are among the most diverse and productive ecosystems on Earth. So now I will start with my talk. I would like to quote the words of the Mapuche singer Soraya Maicoño in her oral narration to the writer and sound artist Dani Selko, featured in this volume of the reunion collection called Pelmaul, an expression in the Mapuche language Mapurundung that means the dream of sound, where she states, "Many Mapuche families still do not recognize themselves as Mapuche. They maintain the need to sing, which is an intrinsic part of our people. Singing situations, giving sound and melody to the moments of life. For that reason, it is necessary to keep the ancient songs alive, to sustain them from the present, in the present, and carry them into a different future. Time is circular. It flows. As the word flows, the song flows, the sound flows, water flows." The flow of water emerged as one of the fundamental concepts often associated with biocultural memory from a Mapuche perspective. The movement of water through rivers, lakes, swamps, underground streams, and the various waterscapes that make up Wallmapu, the Mapuche territory in South America, serves as the foundation for viewing water not as a mere resource, but as a living entity or subject. One of the central themes I want to explore in this talk is the idea of moving beyond the perception of water as a mere resource. But before dealing into this argument, however, I would like to offer a few introductory remarks concerning the notion of conservation as I frame it in the title of this presentation. Various perspectives on the conservation of nature, biodiversity, and art have emerged from practices aimed at maintaining, caring for, preserving, and saving these entities. Many of these approaches are grounded in an ontology that hierarchizes modes of existence, with human beings, particularly those aligned with Western rationality, positioned at the apex of the change of life. Helia Marcal provides an insightful analysis of the connection between conservation and the concept of modernity. For her, it is in the entanglements of modernist knowledge structures and the museum that conservation practices and theories have been shaped. We can make a similar argument in the context of nature conservation, which has become a terrain where the use and protection of nature are developed. Chris Sambrook, for instance, broadly defines nature conservation as those, and I quote, actions intended to establish, improve, or maintain good relations with nature, end of quote. However, the term good relations remain rather imprecise. What underlines both material and immaterial conservation paradigms that have dominated Western discourse over the past few decades is a human-centered model. In this model, the care of art and nature is aimed at preserving the integrity of landscapes or objects, always within the framework of a particular ontology and epistemology about what constitutes a being and what is considered heritage or worthy of preservation. In other words, we can assert that what has prevailed in conservation discourses, often grounded in the trends of preservation, protection, and management, is what I term, following Val Plumwood's, the culture of reason in conservation. Rooted in a rationalistic dualism, this framework identifies the biospheric orders as something required human intervention, manipulation, protection, and transformation in order to maintain a static or genuine form. This culture of reason is inextricably linked to a conception of the relationship between conservation, science, and society, where conservation efforts are legitimized through scientific results. In Plumwood's terms, this represents, and I quote, reason in the form of scientific technical fixes, end of quote, within the techno-optimistic scenarios of natural capitalism. Destructive, oppositional, and colonial dimensions of modern thought have long dominated both conservation practices and theory. In the context of art, this convergence has resulted in what Dominguez Rubio refers to as docile objects, artifacts or practices that conform to the categories defined by museums or institutional frameworks. When it comes to nature, the definition of nature often hinges on its status as a resource to be managed through legal ontologies, typically grounded in national policies or scientific research and recommendations. Even with the contemporary shifts in art that recognize transformation, decay, and the impact of non-intentional material forces, pushing beyond the notion of restoration and the incorporation of co-management principles in natural conservation, what still prevails in practice is the dominance of Western modern ontologies and epistemologies. This culture of reason can also be understood as a form of economic rationalism. Reconsidering the nature-culture dimension of land and aesthetic practices involves not erasing human agency, but rather questioning what form of humanity is then worthy of recognition. Mapuche traditional ecological knowledge, historically dismissed in conservation efforts throughout the Andean Patagonia region, offer us a model that blurs the line between human practices, cosmologies, and nature. For the Mapuche, nature is a vibrant living universe, populated by beings and entities with whom they maintain social relationships. I am to rethink conservation beyond modern scientific, economic, and dualistic models by highlighting a specific case in South America, Patagonia. This example opens the door to, I think, a reconceptualization of conservation in both art and nature. In the Mapuche language, the Patagonian wetlands are referred to by various terms such as magines, mañin, and magin. These terms reflect an effort to describe low or flooded areas where fluvial matter creates a complex web of natural cultural elements. The Patagonian margin is traditionally associated with both natural and economic wealth and has been viewed as an environmental resource for humans and animals alike. But how we consider the sensory power of these wetlands? Can we imagine an aesthetics where lithological, topographical, and hydrological elements converge in these flooded areas of southern Argentina? What kind of ethics of care or understanding of conservation can we derive from the various entanglements within these ecosystems? Teresa Pereda landprints offer a perspective on the Patagonian wetlands that challenges the modern idealization of art. Rather than simply representing nature, it expresses the non-human or more than human power of fluvial matter. Her work embodies both poetic and political gesture of socio-environmental care. It opens up possibilities for relationships that extend beyond exploitation and profit. This series evokes the hybrid assemblage of the marine ecosystem through the remnants of mineral, luminous impressions of aerophytic plants, and sedimentary compounds. This biotic and abiotic force resist the anthropocentric exploitation typical of the livestock and forage industries in the Patagonia, stretching from Neuquén to Tierra del Fuego. Pereda's work subtly challenges what Jason Moore describes as the intersection of capitalism into the web of life. In this way, landprints reverses the codes of extractivism and uncovers the poetic and political potential of these amphibious Patagonian enclaves. This series of work not only reveals wetland capacity to reshape our understanding of nature, but also challenges the regularities and essentialisms that often define it. Instead of viewing the wetlands as static, landprints encourage us to see them as dynamic, aesthetic, historical, and political agents. Pereda submerged cotton fiber papers in the wetlands and allowed time for the materials of the ecosystem to adhere to this paper surface. As she herself states, Landprints is a series in which she acts only as a mediator between the mood of the wetland and its expressive capacity. She also mentions that her respect, and this word is very important, for the wetland manifests through an intervention that simply involves immersing cotton fiber papers in this ecosystem. This approach aligns with the Mapuche worldview of waterscapes. According to ethnographic research by Juana Aigo and Ana Ladio in Mapuche communities in southern Argentina, the concept of respect is central to their traditional knowledge system. This respect is an ethical imperative that emphasizes the need to preserve biodiversity and ensure the long-term health of ecosystem processes. This Mapuche understanding of conservation, rooted in the paradigm of respect, has been largely excluded from discussions about conservation of Patagonian wetlands. The knowledge and worldview of these communities are often ignored in conservation debates, but also, as I want to show with this slide, the different representations about the territory in, for example, cartography, with the national state, a cartography of the indigenous territory, and the cartography of the Mapuche communities. Why it is the case that these worldviews are often ignored in conservation debates. I argue that it's precisely because this notion of respect linked to a sense of responsibility gives all beings in the wetlands, plants, minerals, and animals a status of living agents. For public discourses on conservation, this view is often seen as irrelevant or nonsensical or merely a belief. In this way, the connection between landprints and Mapuche cosmology lies in the shared notion of respect, a respect that acknowledges biocultural memory, traces, and imprints. It reveals the active forces of water bodies, showing them not only as producers of material and resources, but as living dynamic agents. This overlap between human activities and water creates a reality that shifts according to conditions beyond human control. But what does this mean for conservation discourses and practices? Which voices count when ecological care and restoration are needed in South American endangered waterscapes? Who decides what is conserved and when? What will be the goal of future or forthcoming conservation? In the context of the climate crisis and within the framework of the inequalities that trace a separation of North and South under the logic of neocolonialism, of late liberalism, it is urgent to think of an answer to these questions. To respond is not to provide solutions. It is to be willing to converse with the other, to dialogue, to think together. The codependence between nature and culture come to light all the time. The materials from which art objects are made are constantly changing and altering. Just as the bodies in performance are altered, the paper in photographic records change and turn yellow. Nothing lasts forever, and in the face of discourses about extinction or stories about time and death of human and other species, we might ask ourselves, conserve for what or for whom? The central idea behind these questions is that there are no universal models for the conservation of art and nature. This non-universality is challenged every time we approach a specific territory and the communities connected to that land. Practices of making worlds, as Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blazer, and Arturo Escobar describe, given rise to pluriverses. This work of Teresa Pereda and the Mapuche eco-cosmological practices, such as singing, showing respect, asking permission for the waters, invoking the guardians of water, and engaging in subsistent practices that resist commodification, all converge in an epistemological and ontological framework for conservation based on relationality and codependence. In the three ecologies, Felix Guattari argues that addressing the ecological crisis requires a planetary scale revolution, not just in production and consumption, but in the molecular fields of sensibility, intelligence, and desire. Landprints and Mapuche knowledge tradition participate in this kind of molecular struggle where the sensory force of the wetland challenges modern aesthetic principles that transform how we care for them. Nature in this context is not a pristine or uninhabited, rather it is a complex web of interrelations. Studies on the conservation of aquatic bodies in Patagonia have demonstrated that the diversity of these ecosystems emerge from decades and decades of coexistence and cooperation between Mapuche communities and the form of life of these territories. So one might wonder why the national parks models continue to uphold an idea of nature that requires care while simultaneously erasing the role of the communities. And if we saw the website of the National Administration of Natural Parks in Argentina, there are only pictures of the beauty of the landscape and not of the people. Even the co-management areas within Patagonia National Park expose the relationship between conservation, truth, legitimacy, and power, reaffirming that scientific knowledge is the sole holder of authority. As with Teresa Pereda artistic practices, it is almost impossible sometimes to conceive of these prints as product of her, it is almost impossible to conceive of the prints as product of her direct intervention. Instead, it is the minerals and other elements of the wetland that print themselves onto the paper. Land prints invite us to reconsider how the sensory dimension of organic and mineral existences forces collaborative survival. Community-based practices resist the extractive view that wetlands are mere resources for capitalist and agro-industrial exploitation, and instead propose that conservation should aim to ensure the survival of this ecosystem with the people, not as commodities, but as sites of creative, generative, and spiritual power. Both eco, cosmo, aesthetic, and political practices reveal the Patagonian wetlands are ecosystems with a potential to expose alternative worlds and conservation models. In this sense, these southern wetlands are not mere sites of political and economic contention. They are also spaces of poetic, spiritual, and affective potential. They are tied to this kind of ethical demand of, in Maria Puig de la Bella Casa words, elucidating how different configurations of knowledge practices are consequential contributing to specific rearrangements. I argue that the economic, social, and political order of the Maginas is rooted in their imaginary and material capacities, as demonstrated through land prints and traditional Mapuche practices. These prints create, through the interaction of water, human immersion, and non-human elements, lithological, hydrological, topographical, rejects dualism at the basis of imaginative production. By challenging the authority of modern Western capitalist perspective, Pereda's works resist subject-centered aesthetics and politics. As an ethnographer, she engaged with the territory, revealing the complex interconnection within sensory worlds. Her response to the expressivity of the wetlands showed that it is possible to engage with the land through collective rather than individual imagination, while also highlighting how interdependence sustains the life of these ecosystems and their multiple connections to human worlds, as the Mapuche communities do from different perspectives. In contrast to individualism, this series emphasizes the symbiotic or collaborative action that brings these prints to life. Land prints reject, in this sense, creative individuality, instead proposing an eco-political aesthetics that consider the Patagonian wetlands in both economic and aesthetic dimension. In conclusion, if we are to resist the barbarism of profit-driven exploitation, land prints and eco-cosmological practices of care maybe offers an alternative perspective. They reveal the Magines as ecosystem where a politics of conservation emerged from the sensibility of their fluvial matter. Through a network of connections within this unique fluvial system, the poetic force of the Majin interwent with human actions, reshaping our collective imagination. In this sense, Pereda's series and the melodies sung by the Mapuche communities to the water pushes us to rethink how care disrupts the life of art and demands a very different point of view to the one that has dominated the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this extremely interesting and thought-provoking paper. We do, after all, have time for a couple of questions because we have to fix the small problem we have with the network. So if anybody has a question for Julia, we're very happy to take it.
Super interesting. Thank you. One very concrete question. Could you explain a little bit more how the Mapuche community is organized? I mean, are there people passing on those songs, or is it like a shared culture, or, just...
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, and it's also a difficult question because it's like a very contested issue in Argentina now, how Mapuche communities resist to this kind of threat of the national state that sometimes don't want to recognize their fights and their perception around about the world. So in terms of political organization, I don't know if the question was in relation to that or more like an historical. Yeah, it's a collective practice that is inherited through generations, but also one important thing is how the imposition of the modern thought with colonization and the advance of the national state in the Patagonia, in the south of Argentina, cut in some time that tradition, and people have to relearn not only about the language, but also about this tradition of caring for these ecosystems and different kind of water bodies. So in that sense, there is a strong now movement of rethinking Mapuche tradition and relearning many traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge about how to think the territory, how to engage with it, and also the practices that are practices that involve Mapuche communities and non-Mapuche communities in the south. Thank you.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me, and congratulations to the organizers, because it's really a beautiful thread. I have the feeling throughout the day and yesterday. And I'm also happy to find myself in the company of such amazing and also long-term fellows and colleagues. So really looking forward to bring the discussion on. Yes, so I'm interested in the... Good. Yeah, let's just put, okay. I'm interested in the preservation of contemporary art at the intersection of art history, curation, and conservation. And my research is based on theory as well as my own practice, installing contemporary art and working closely with artists and artistic estates. So I'm talking about preservation, and I'm very clear about this. We can have a discussion about this, but I'm very, very sensitive, having worked with conservators and restorers, that this is really a profession that also needs a certain kind of protection, because it's, at least for example in Germany, it's not a protected profession. And when there are other disciplines coming in, like curatorial practice or so on, for me that's the reason to talk about preservation, which means like an enlarged, let's say, kind of discipline. So today I want to contextualize some of the latest discussions in the conservation discourse. I think that's really important because there has been such a change, like fundamental change within the last 30 years. And a lot of you who are here have been shaped this discourse, and it's really important to bring this to the forefront, I think. So such as the processual and changing nature of art preservation and the growing importance of networks of care situated outside of traditional memory institutions, for example. And I will put this into the broader background of contemporary art in the atomic age we are living in. So the historical beginning of contemporary art is often dated to the event of the dropping of the first atomic bomb and the end of World War II in 1945. Against the backdrop of these turning points, performative, process-based and ephemeral art practices emerged more prominently, emphasizing temporality as a central aspect of contemporary art. And I just brought some images. It's really more an illustration, but just like that we come into the mood perhaps about what we are talking about. This temporal shift required rethinking conservation practice in recent decades beyond its traditional focus on physical durability to align with the evolving nature of contemporary works. Constantly new interpretations temporalize the works, ensuring their contemporaneity with changing historical and cultural contexts. Preservation, therefore, transcends mere material conservation. It becomes an active, time-bound process, as I will argue. When dealing with questions of preservation, it sometimes seems as if there are only two possibilities for contemporary art, either absolute oblivion or constant visibility. Now, one might ask why this art in particular is so affected by the possibility of loss. If, as discussed, the aspect of contemporaneity becomes a central one, the transience of the material can consequently be thought of as a symptom of the underlying temporal dimensions of the work. Ultimately, temporality itself becomes the subject of preservation. From this perspective, approaches to halting transience by, for example, making organic material more durable, assume a misunderstanding, namely that by trying to ensure the survival of the material, the work could, in a sense, be snatched from the flow of time. One could now say that a kind of timelessness would be aimed at a state outside of time, owed to the desire not to let the object age, for instance. So in conservation discourse in the 1980s, for example, modern art conservator Heinz Althofer characterized the art of the post-war period of the 20th century as follows. If one understands the choice of material as an expression dependent on the respective time, the material transience is related to the simultaneous cultural sensitization for the ruinousness and fragmentation of time in the face of historical developments such as wars, new communication and mobilization technologies. Curator Paul Schimmel describes the historical context, for example, as the starting point of performance art. After World War II, the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, a shift in consciousness occurred throughout the world. The possibility of global annihilation made people more aware than ever before of the fragility of a creation that was at the mercy of destructive forces of unprecedented proportions. And it also gave them more insights into the primacy of action. So as I showed some examples, like more from the like Western art, let's say, in the United States, Europe, and Japan, for example, they the production of those performative, ephemeral, and other, like embracing decay, for example, artistic practices has been arisen from this topic, including like also like a destructive act, as we saw it in the beginning with Gustav Metzger. The opposing movement of art aiming for intactness and perfection, we might think of Jeff Koons, for example, as well, in which every touch or patina is to be avoided, is ultimately only the contrasting expression of the same sentiment. Conservator Robert Wilmot also placed this upheaval in the context of the omnipresent nuclear threat in the 20th century. I quote, "Contemporary society is far less inclined to plan for posterity than previous generations. There are many reasons for this, but perhaps the most readily agreed is the real threat of nuclear war and the end of life as we know it." Wilmot's diagnosis of the time led him to a sobering view as far as preservation was concerned. Quote, "These effects and others make the traditional role of the art museum as collector and preserver anachronistic to a very considerable extent." The statement that conventional conservation was anachronistic against the backdrop of the constant existential threat of a nuclear war was aimed at the necessity of revisiting preservation approaches as early as the beginning in the 1980s and even before. So today, this revision only occurs with a time lag, one could say. So contemporary art, as we have seen, and also contemporary art conservation and preservation, detaches itself from the idea of endurement through the material fixation of an artwork. On the contrary, it is about the continuous contemporalization, a permanent examination of the still in time existent. In short, about the assurance of having survived. Unfortunately, this topic is more urgent today than ever before, given the worldwide political crisis and wars. The present itself thus becomes the object of preservation, not in the sense of visualizing the past, but of experience the present. This constitutes the unique relationship between contemporary art and its conservation and makes the field of what I even call preservation studies the most exciting research area for me, at least at the moment. So since a process takes place in time, the processual understanding of the work implies a new temporal dimension. The works last. Temporality is thus understood structurally here. The temporal expansion of the preservation process also changes the view of the temporal dimensions of the work itself. So we have plenty of conservation examples where we can really follow the change of the identity of an artwork through different interpretations. And thus, it becomes like a processual understanding of the artworks, like in each different context it has been, let's say, preserved. The fundamental relationship between time and preservation has been addressed, for example, by Hanna when she differentiates between two temporalities, autochronic and allochronic. Regarding conservation practice, Hölling argues for the abandonment of the dichotomy between traditional enduring objects and ephemeral short duration objects. Instead of asking, I quote, her conservators to perform the impossible feat of arresting change, we would think of artworks of all kinds as ever-changing and evolving entities that continually undergo physical alternations and transitions. In this respect, the intervention through conservation merely represents a further change in the temporal structure of a work. And it's really fascinating to see how this discourse has changed over the last years and really embracing change as yeah, as a significant part in conservation. So that leads me to another question. If you think of the preservation of contemporary art as mainly about processes and practices, is it possible that the temporality itself that needs to be preserved? And I quote Boris Groys, who proposed a conceptual shift in this understanding that time-based art is, in fact, art-based time. So time thus only becomes visible at all through art. Consequently, it is time itself that becomes visible when conservation becomes visible, as it is time-bound in its values and interpretations. So, and of course, like what I also think that we need is really another kind of discussion about contemporary art and like what do we actually see or experience in, for example, those different kind of instantiations and what kind of values have been behind the scenes, for example, that shape those installations and instantiations. And for example, one of my favorite example in this context is Lamella's media art installation from Venice Biennial, where like it's complex, but like basically they were reading the news from the Vietnam War out loud. So there was a performer and the audience could listen to it. And then there was this interpretation of the MoMA later where they actually basically understood it as a sculpture and just like molded all the like pieces so that had been lost, and which brings us back to the institutional understanding and objectification machine. And it was really interesting talk with the conservator of the MoMA, with the at Tate, with the artists, and they were very open about this problem. So it was really fruitful to have this discussion also in public. And at the same time, Lamella's who like searched for chairs and so on eBay, also like allowed, let's say, another interpretation of someone like reading social media news later. So that could just like really be a starting point to understand like what is actually like the work defining properties as it is in conservation theory, and also like how can we communicate let's say core characteristics of contemporary art. So and that brings me to actually step a little bit back and asking like what is actually contemporary art, and depending on one's point of view, different dates are assumed for the historical beginning of contemporary art. As I said, the year 1945, for instance, refers to the post-war period with the first atomic bombing and the catastrophes of the Second World War, while, for example, also the date 1989 is discussed, which marks the end of the Cold War. So contemporary can be understood semantically as a temporal relation. As Richard Meyer explains in more detail in What Was Contemporary Art, the variant co-temporary was especially common in the 17th and 18th centuries and contains even more strongly the meaning of co-presence. Consequently, understanding something as contemporary also means broadening the perspective to the context. By asking contemporary with what, we are forced to look beyond the individual artist or, let's say, masterwork to a broader field of artistic and cultural production. Furthermore, the English prefix con, as found today in contemporary art, also implies the commonality with time. In this context, again, Boris Groys refers to another meaning of the term, namely to be the comrade of time, in a literal sense, like Zeitgenosse, as collaborating with time, helping time when it has problems, when it has difficulties. So the reference to time in this in the preservation of contemporary art, as stated, does not bring the material through time as a durable and unchanging as possible, but to preserve the temporality of the work itself. This contemporaneity of contemporary preservation ultimately causes contemporary works to always be tied back to time. To be with time, to be contemporary means, as Giorgio Agamben puts it, I quote, to divide time, to insert caesuras that make it readable in the first place. So how can we actually understand change by seeing differences over time? So, and the very act of conservation or preservation would thus be one of those possible caesuras. So the act of preservation is thus at the same time a historical marker and enables the experience of temporality. So it's really interesting to then go into depth, of course, like what is the trajectory of an artwork, but also like really understanding that we need to, or like arguing that we need to understand the dynamics of preservation as a condition for contemporary art. And what I want to suggest is actually a radical perspective on preservation practices enabling the contemporaneity of contemporary art in the atomic age. So conservation and preservation are like by these means shaping this process by creating differences. And conservation becomes a condition for contemporary art. So for the last minutes I have, I want to stress out one point, because I have been been confronted with the question, then how can you pass on like those artistic practices, but also like what we talked about, like those work defining properties or the core of like the idea of an artwork, for example, and how can we record and pass on at the same time those practices and informations over long periods of time. So that brought me to one of the most interesting discussions around methods of long-term communication that take place concerning the afterlife of nuclear waste and how to warn future generations of these sites. So we already heard a little bit about this today, so I don't go too deep into this, but just say that the problem of radioactive waste is a good starting point for searching for the way to shape information that will be perfectly legible in the future. So this also brings another aspect to our culture-nature discussion, I think. While decay is the foundation for regenerating life as a biological process, it can also stand for contamination and a growing death threat. Or as Ravi put it yesterday, it's a question of survival. So the Human Interference Task Force, formed by the United States Department of Energy in 1981, sought ways to keep humans from inadvertently encountering radioactive waste stored at sites like the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. The time horizon started with 10,000 years and has been extended to 1 million years in the meantime. So we are not talking about like the next generation, but we are talking about thousands of generations. And I'm sure that our archaeological colleagues can elaborate more on these time spans, also thinking about our like oldest monuments or cultural objects that we know so far. So they discussed anything. So it's like one of those examples also, it's invisible from the outside. So how do you prevent people going there? So they discussed from like building huge monuments to actually searching what they did in Finland now for the most boring landscape that there is in order to not at all gain any attention for this site. So how would you, like if you would paint it red, like people in 1,000 years perhaps would say like, oh, that's super interesting, let's dig there because it's marked. So like how can you translate this information actually? So the task force suggested oral transmission as a means of preserving warnings for future generations. As linguists proposed the seeding and nurturing of a body of folklore around Yucca Mountain with annual rituals to spread the stories forward, so-called atomic priesthood. And we heard about the Ise Shrine today, for example, where there are like those circular rituals since many hundred years. What fascinates me is the fact that in addition to scientists, writers, and artists were also involved in this discussion from the very beginning. Science fiction author and futurologist Stanislav Lem, for example, considered DNA code to be the best method for conveying data. I quote, "It's still the same code today as it was 4 billion years ago with regard to its alphabet structure and semantics," he wrote in his essay, "Encoding Data on a Living Medium." According to him, the DNA of plants at the waste site could be used to store information about the radioactive nature of the area, and he suggested genetically modified blue flowers that would catch the attention of humans. Just in recent years, science started to observe that, for example, trees can enter into mutual interactions thanks to mushrooms, or plants are capable of remembering, whereas in many indigenous cultures, this knowledge about plant-based communication has always been there, as we also have seen in this Mapuche culture community. So the premise for this approach is that we learn to develop a sensitivity for an awareness of what nature communicates to us. And I show one example of an installation by Lynn Hirschman, because another proposal by philosopher François Bastide and Paolo Fabri was creating a living radiation detector in the form of some species that would persist alongside humans, giving the hypothetical of a species of cat that would be called ray cats. And like, it's super interesting, for example, of course, to see also that the cat has a long-standing relation to human culture, like back to Egypt and before. So they further proposed inventing a body of folklore passed on through proverbs and myths to explain that people should flee when a cat changes color. So, and I have like two other final examples. One is Cecilia Vicuña. So it's interesting when we think about this long-term communication, like, for example, like Australian songlines, which is one of the oldest record systems we know, which is like 10,000 years old. There are other ancient recording and communication systems, such as the Kipu, a system encoding information through notes, for example. It was used by the Quechua people of the Andes from 2500 BCE through to the 16th century at the time of the Spanish conquest. Although the exact meaning behind the knot formations are not known now, it is thought that they were used to record statistics, poems, and stories, thereby creating a tactile relationship to memory and the imaginary. Artist Cecilia Vicuña has been exploring and transforming the Kipu in her work for over 5 decades. And finally, I come to Anna Oppermann, that I never can miss in one of my talks, because she has been really like at the center of a lot of those thoughts over the past years. So, and you know, I mean, many of you know, I have published on this, so I won't go too deep into this, but it's just interesting that she is a German conceptual artist who developed a method and a practice in the 1970s that was actually processual, kind of ensemble method, she called it. So around topics like being a mother, being an artist, like really, let's say, universal topics in a way. And she had this method starting with a meditation of a natural object and then expanding it through different layers. So, like having a brainstorming phase, and then also make drawings, and then like collecting other reference systems, like citations from philosophers or even like from the newspaper, and she worked on those like decades long. So in total there are 70s of huge and smaller ensembles, and she always, what you can see here, took a picture of the last installation and then integrated this into the next one. So you have a very transparent kind of view of this recursive, like always going back to what has been there, but also adding new layers to it. And even now, posthumously, there could be the practice to adding new aspects to those works. So that's actually my job, also like to pass this kind of method and practice through on to the next generation.
Hi, I'm Rodney Harrison. I'm Professor of Heritage Studies at University College London. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm very pleased to be able to present my paper to you, Beyond Natural and Cultural Heritage, Reimagining Heritage for the Carbocene. To many, the idea that the objects, places, practices, and human and non-human communities that make up our natural and cultural heritage are distinct from one another and could be managed and sustained without reference to the interconnections between them would be a strange one. Indeed, such a perspective is now generally perceived to be an artifact of a modern colonial worldview which reinforced notions of human exceptionalism to justify exploitative, unequal, and hierarchical relations between different groups of people who were perceived to be racially and culturally distinct from one another. Based on such a view, throughout the 20th century, an increasingly siloed set of professional fields developed to manage a range of natural and cultural resources, understood very much through the lens of their values for human use and exploitation, and in doing so, in many cases, have exacerbated rather than assisted with processes of environmental and cultural degradation. Today, we live globally with the legacies of these developments, which in practice mean a fragmented system of international and national policies, laws, and professional practices, in which attempts to preserve one specific form of heritage might in fact hinder or at best trouble attempts to preserve another. Indeed, one of the major findings of our comparative international 4-year multi-researcher empirical study of 25 different fields of conservation practice called Heritage Futures was precisely that the work of different forms of natural and cultural heritage preservation practices is generally undertaken without reference to their relationship or impacts on others, and that these impacts are often negative or conflictual, diminishing the efficacy of the individual practices in question. As such, the worlds and the futures which one form of natural, cultural, tangible, or intangible heritage preservation practice works towards realizing are rarely in alignment, and often significantly out of alignment with others. In the light of the significant global and regional challenges affecting the environment and the driving forces affecting both cultural and natural heritage, including climate change, changing and intensifying land uses, urbanization and demographic change, new and more effective coordinated approaches to the conservation and management of natural, cultural, tangible and intangible heritage are urgently required. The problems arising from the ontological and practical separation of nature and culture and the associated fragmentation of the management of heritage objects, places and practices are familiar to many global majority peoples, including many of the world's indigenous peoples who've long called into question such approaches. Questions of the intersection of cultural heritage with environmental health, for example, are more keenly felt when one perceives the land itself to be part of one's identity and the plants, animals and natural forces to be one's kin. Similarly, we know that climate change impacts the world's most disadvantaged peoples most disproportionately, highlighting the important connections between environmental, racial and social justice. Accordingly, the 6th and latest assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability stated explicitly for the first time that colonialism, racism and other systemic, historical and contemporary forms of inequality have unequivocally exacerbated the impacts of climate change and have contributed directly to the uneven vulnerability of both people and ecosystems to climate change across the world. A further parallel development in ways of understanding the more than human rights and legal status of the environment has emerged alongside of this. Over the past 2 decades, several countries, including Bangladesh, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, India, Mexico City, New Zealand, Uganda, and several tribal councils in the United States have recognized the legal rights of specific non-humans, for example, rivers or mountains, and or their associated ecosystems, or even more expansively, just nature in general, to exist and to thrive. Such legal developments are distinct from, yet overlap with, the 2022 United Nations General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a basic human right, in the sense in which they also recognize the rights of non-humans to exist independently of their contribution to human health and well-being. A recent UK Law Society report, Law in the Emerging Bio-Age, notes the importance of these newly emerging rights discourses, and I'll quote from the report now. Rights have been granted, and more are currently being sought in different jurisdictions globally, for elephants, trees, rivers, ecosystems, and landscapes. Rights for non-humans communicates our dependence on and greater role for nature in decision-making. The process and execution of a non-human rights-based framework in international and local law may differ radically from a human rights-based approach. For example, if rights were granted to non-humans or living systems, then questions of liability for damage to the environment, such as climate change or biodiversity loss, also arise. That's a close of quote. These discussions raise further questions not only of liability, but what forms the reparations for such liabilities, losses, and damages to non-humans might take. An integrated system in which natural and cultural heritage values are understood as related to one another means that the rights of both humans and non-humans can come to be understood and evaluated collectively rather than in competition with one another. A number of international non-government organisations have recently drawn attention to the problems arising from the fragmentation of the management of natural and cultural heritage. Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, noted in 2009 the need for closer integration of work on biological and cultural diversity conservation, leading to the development of a UNESCO Convention on Biological Diversity joint program between biological and cultural diversity, which culminated in their 2014 Florence Declaration on the links between biological and cultural diversity. Similarly, the World Heritage Leadership Programme, a partnership between ICCROM, IUCN and the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and the Environment, in collaboration with the World Heritage Centre in ICOMOS, aims to draw attention to the links between nature and culture and help to improve conservation and management practices for both. Despite this, the precise mechanisms by which the interdependencies and interactions between human and non-human persons, culture and nature might be effectively protected and managed have not been well articulated. The interrelationship between human rights and the environment have been particularly highlighted as a strategic priority for the Council of Europe, with whom I've recently collaborated on the development of a series of guidelines for the integrated management of nature, culture and landscapes, which draws on and extends our Heritage Futures research. Loss of biodiversity, climate change, extinction of species, pollution and the overall degradation of the Earth's ecosystems have a profound global impact on the enjoyment of human rights and require the widest possible cooperation. It's only through taking an integrated, holistic and cross-sectoral approach based on an understanding of natural diversity, cultural environment and climate as interrelated and understood in context that we will be able to address the crises which equally threaten the cultural and natural environment and both tangible and intangible cultural heritage alike. Based in the Council of Europe's human rights and participatory approach and its conventions in the fields of culture, nature and landscape, the recently published Link Guiding Principles for an Integrated Approach to Culture, Nature and Landscape Management introduce a number of relevant actions and tools that can be used at national, regional or local levels as appropriate to strengthen the inseparable links between people, culture and nature and to better protect and expand cultural, natural and landscape diversity. These draw on a holistic, integrated approach to policy making, management, research and practice, with an emphasis on environmental justice and social and economic inequalities. In the light of the fact that the cultural and natural environment are to a large extent managed by the same measures and instruments, protected areas, conventions, legislation, guidelines and policies, the aim of the guidelines is to highlight new ways of combining or integrating these measures to better protect and expand cultural, natural and landscape diversity, which is vital for sustainable development and the well-being of societies. The guiding principles also suggest possible ways to align existing practices with this more integrative approach, taking into account both the diversity of specific national contexts and the non-binding character of these guidelines in Europe. But there must be more to heritage preservation and management. There must be more to heritage than simply preservation and management. It's now widely acknowledged and understood that humans have modified the climate and environment to such an extent that it's no longer possible to assume that the geology, ecology, and climate of the planet will remain in a stable state, even over the scale of individual human lifetimes. This suggests that heritage managers themselves must accept some degree of environmental and physical change, including the loss of some cultural and natural resources, especially in cultural environments, as inevitable. Especially in coastal environments, as inevitable. Heritage management has conventionally pitched itself against such changes through active processes of conservation, but a focus on landscapes and integrated understandings of cultural and natural values holds much potential for refocusing heritage managed efforts towards working productively with, rather than against, what we now know is inevitable processes of change. New management concepts, such as adaptive release, defined as reflecting an active decision to accommodate and interpret the dynamic transformation of a heritage asset and its associated values and significance with reference to wider landscape settings, are particularly relevant here. Equally, such approaches suggest the need to move away from a focus on conservation of individual species, objects, places, and practices, to focus instead on the values that arise from the connections and interdependencies between them. Our work on reimagining museums for climate action has also shown how heritage organisations need to change substantially to rethink and reimagine their role in the light of the climate emergency. In the Museums Toolbox we developed as part of the project, Mobilising Museums for Climate Action, we proposed 5 practical pathways to climate action within museums. These are reducing emissions in museums, supporting society to reduce emissions, ensuring museums are fit for the future to adapt to climate change, supporting society's adaptation, and ensuring that climate action is fair and contributes to broader sustainable development goals. But these practical goals can only be achieved by taking further action to rethink the roles of museums and heritage in society. And to this end, I think there are another 5 ways which I would suggest museums in particular, and heritage more generally, need to fundamentally change to reimagine themselves for climate action. These can be extrapolated to the heritage sector more generally. So firstly, they need to reckon with their histories and how those histories continue to play out in the present. As ongoing discussions around the restitution of looted colonial objects show, they need to take a critical look at their histories and the role that the narratives that they've produced, narratives of human exceptionalism, hierarchical understandings of human culture, and an emphasis on progress and civilization, have underpinned and helped to produce the current climate crisis. Secondly, they need to rapidly decarbonise. Museum buildings and their operations, especially things like touring exhibitions, are incredibly carbon intensive. And this means benchmarking success differently, not in terms of numbers of visitors, but in how they interact with and facilitate social action. They need to take a critical look at who they associate with and the sponsorship they receive, as current protests regarding fossil fuel sponsorship across the world are emphasising. In addition to telling their own stories differently, they need to tell different stories. Any museum could be a climate museum, and some of the ideas in our project's exhibition and the various project outputs explore how this might be done. And finally, they need to see their role differently as facilitators for individuals and communities to catalyse and support them in taking the climate action they wish to take, rather than as authorities. Every part of society will need to make radical changes to ensure that global heating remains below or at 1.5 degrees, and this includes museums and the cultural sector. The heritage sector could, and in many cases are keen to play a leading role in these transformations, but like all of society, they will only be able to do so if they make significant changes to the ways they operate, the stories they tell, and how they're told, the sponsorship they receive, and the ways in which they perceive their roles in relation to the publics they serve. And these are questions we aim to address as part of a new international collaborative project we've just begun, called Petroculture's Intersections with the Cultural Heritage Sector in the Context of Green Transitions, or PITCH. Funded by a large Horizon Europe and UK Research and Innovation grant, the project aims to enable citizens to confidently engage the constantly changing nature of cultural heritage and its relationship to modern petrocultures, and to provide heritage practitioners and policymakers with the tools to repurpose existing and future forms of heritage to facilitate just green transitions. PITCH brings together academic and cultural sector organisation partners in 6 European countries to spur on the processes by which humanities and arts scholarship and public interventions can strengthen citizen engagement with the constantly changing nature of cultural heritage, its relationship to past and present petrocultures, to lay the groundwork for rapid society-wide European green transitions away from reliance on fossil fuels. I conclude with some observations which I believe must guide heritage designation, management and preservation in the future. Fundamentally, it's no longer possible to maintain the distinction between natural and cultural heritage, and it never really was. The idea of the Anthropocene or the Carbocene undermines this explicitly. This suggests we need a broader framework for understanding heritage by looking at other forms of Anthropocene legacies, which tend to be less explicitly valorized, such as waste, species extinction or biodiversity loss, and climate. It's only through understanding both positively and negatively valued forms of heritage in parallel with one another that heritage will be able to come to engage creatively with, rather than work against, inevitable forms of ecological, social and political change. In doing so, we will need to engage both heritage practitioners and publics in debates about the short, medium and long-term futures of heritage, and the role of conservation practices in actively constructing future worlds. And finally, we need to engage heritage critically and think about its social, material, ecological and ontological impacts, and explore new ways of doing heritage differently. Many heritage professionals have taken the climate and extinction emergencies as a cue to do heritage the way that it's always been done, only with more vigour and increased moral licence. I would suggest that the opposite is the case, that in the context of the climate emergency, heritage needs to be done critically, and we need to find new ways of doing it. Thank you for your time.
Before the break and the tour in the Conservation Restoration Department for a few questions for Julia and Anna. So here is your chance to put questions to them, comment on their talk. Yeah.
Thank you for your lovely talks, and thank you, Rodney. Unfortunately, you are not online, but I just wanted to say that actually this image that Rodney showed at the end of his presentation is a little bit obsolete, because the Venetians, they put in place the Moises system, and somehow Aqua Alta is not happening anymore. So I thought about like, at least not at this level. But anyway, I enjoyed a lot Juliana's talk, and I have a question for you related to kind of your you went through this kind of like comparison between the kind of cultural conservation and natural conservation, and you said about this human-centered kind of conservation, right? The human being kind of is in the center of conservation. And I thought about the discourses within our fields that we actually, it feels like we have arrived just recently into this idea that actually human being has to be in the center of conservation efforts, not the subjects of conservation, not the objects of conservation, but the human being. And I'm just thinking about the next step in this development. So if we are thinking about this beautiful notion of respect that you have been talking about, how we could somehow go back to think together, which is another beautiful concept that you also have been mentioning, how we can go back to thinking together and with the objects of our care, or with in the broader context, how to think together as a next step of the development of the field of cultural conservation, for example. So we came from this object-based, then to human-based, and now how to integrate this thinking together and not maybe something based, but a collaborative form of yes, of developing this cultural conservation as it is happening in natural conservation in this context of wetlands in Argentina.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Many things cross my mind. First, in relation to this human-centered perspective in conservation, I think that there is something important to address in the centering the human discourses or more than human debates or in general in the post-humanities is what we mean, what we mention human. So what conception of humanity would have. So for me, a great example is what many indigenous thinkers as Ailton Krenak in the Amazon in Brazil, and also Davi Kopenawa Yanomami mentioned that the notion of humanity is a normative notion and has been shaped by the Western characteristics of what a human counts, because also you know that since the conquest, humanity from the indigenous community is something that is suspect. Now, you know, if you read Levi-Strauss or if you read many of the ethnographic work in the Americas, it is very easy to find how being human from like the indigenous communities, being human is something that is in doubt. It's a doubt, you know, from the... So in that sense, I think that my point was to rethink the notion of humanity, which humanity counts in these conservation efforts, because clearly for the initiatives, conservation in national parks in many places, what counts as human is not the practices of the communities that lives in these places. So in that sense, I think that maybe a good form to rephrase that idea is like who or which notion of humanity is shaping the nature and the nature conservation initiatives. So something related to that. I don't know if it was clear. And in relation to the notion of respect and think together, I don't know, it's very difficult to say, okay, what is the solution? Also, I was thinking, well, no, it's good. Now it's good. Okay. I was thinking with this presentation of Rooney Harrison about how was the Reimagine Museum for Climate, how was actions, and I was thinking of this kind of saying what we have to do. I don't know what the rest of the people think about, like reducing the emissions, like this kind of, okay, the good things that we need to do are these ones, like, I don't know, for me it's a very like Western perspective, no? What we have to do is this, no? And reducing the emission from what perspective you are talking. So I don't know, something to discuss and what means to to work together. I think that is the responsibility that we need to take that as a task, as something that we have to develop, and to take into account that there are different visions and worldviews and perspectives, and there is not a universal model of how to proceed in this. And one, we realize that there is not a universal model of how to proceed. I think that we open the door to collaboration and to also to acknowledge the fragility that we are now. So yes, like.
Yes, I just like a small comment. Thank you so much, and I love this idea of non-universality, and I think that it's also play out as a kind of nice criticism towards the proposal of Rodney here, that you know, it's difficult to build strategies that are flexible to accommodate this non-universality, but somehow I totally agree with you that there is a need for doing that. Thank you so much again.
Thank you to both of you. Not only I thought these were brilliant talks, but also that there were so many resonances between the two of you while your focus was so different. And one of the points that I found really strong is the centrality that your talk in the end, Anna, gave to the idea of transmission. So something that is really working on engaging with a heritage as something that is living and that is plural and that is transforming and that asks not for replication as identical, but as something that deploys in plural appropriations and transformations. And I thought that there was maybe something that could be a link between your approaches and artists, like the two artists that you spoke about. And maybe, Julia, there's something that I missed because I probably haven't followed properly where I wondered where actually the work that Teresa Pereira is doing, could you read it or would you read it as a kind of translation or transmission that she also carries from actors that are not her, and where she creates a space for these forms to deploy in a material form, but also relating to Mapuche communities. And as you already spoke, I'd like to Anna first.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I must admit that I lost the last part of it because I was drawn away by my thoughts. So perhaps you can add to this because I was thinking about another distinction between, because, you know, like what you said, like with the human-centeredness, let's say, or like that the subject comes in actually in conservation practice and theory now is really something like, let's say, like recent, whatever. So it's like, and for me in the German words, Erhaltung and Bewahrung, that's always like very clear to me actually, that it's actually not anymore Bewahrung. And the Bewahrung means like in the sense of a truth-seeking practice, you know, that there is this original or this truth or this whatever, so that you need to reconstruct. But Erhaltung, which means more kind of attitude, you know, and you really have to have an attitude like being confronted with all those challenges and yeah, put yourself in there and engage with it and yeah, transform those energies. And it's like a physical but also like a ethical attitude you need. So for me that's always like to have another word or distinction up there. That's a really yeah, for me a very helpful distinction between those fields or like concepts of thinking about conservation. Yeah.
Thank you. I really thank you for your connection between the two presentations, and also I really like what Anna said in relation to an ethical attitude, because I think that is that for me is very important in research and around these topics. So in relation to translation and transmission and dialogue, I think that like in the cases that I am working with, and also thinking about contemporary art practices that connects with indigenous cosmologies, like in the case of Teresa Pereda, translation is one of the most important points. And translation means also a form of mediation that acknowledge also that is something that is lost in this process. And what is lost is the eloquence also, like I speaking in English, like this loss of eloquence and this loss of like the whole picture of what being part of a community means. But at the same time, this kind of responsibility and response to the need to be with others. So it is also something in relation to how to think together. Teresa work processes in the Majins in the south, in Mapuche territory, so she's also engaged with these communities, but at the same time, she is not part of the community. And she tries to make like this kind of conversation with some eco-cosmological forms of knowledge of Mapuche community about conceiving water bodies as living entities, and also try to conceive artistic practices, or more than artistic, because art is always a problem, but sensible practices, aesthetic practices, now this kind of somatics that I was thinking about, that's something that also is related to nature. So I was thinking in the presentation of Laura Martin about design in nature, and nature being an artist and producing also, and being creative, and this kind of autonomy. And I think that this is something that it has been for centuries and centuries in the indigenous knowledge. And now we are like being aware that this has been like for a long time in this dismissed knowledge, and not consider like, something that we have to think, and yeah.
Also to add, like being, we discussed this with Lotte also this noon, like how actually your methodology as a researcher then also changes how you approach those issues, you know. And I mean, it's really like, as we are researchers, like starting from our point of view, you know, and how, and we talked about like ethnography, for example, that how to put yourself in there when you are perhaps like not part of like a situation and so on. So that's super interesting for me also on this method question.
Just to add, and it's also to connect from today and yesterday, I feel that we are touching a point that was already raised in your talk, Len, about the list of what is in common, not in common, in the two fields. And I think collaboration was perhaps missing. But collaboration, what does it mean? And it was the discussion we had in our group about what are the ethical, or what are the conditions of collaboration. Because we are speaking about collaboration, like, oh, it's nice to be collaborative. But it's really, it's this political, ethical, practical aspect of collaboration that I think you have been illustrating beautifully in the discussion now. Part of what is the loss also in the sake of collaboration that we are ready to take, to open up to, and not invite people only, because it's nice to invite, but there's a power relationship there. So it's how do we practice that? And I think in both cases, both fields as well as across the fields, we need to ask this question. And it was also, I think, connected with your last question yesterday, a lot about how we decentered ourselves. And yes, we have to think of, I think it's part of what you are saying, it's how do we collaborate? So who are missing? Who are the people missing? And it's not the shareholders or I don't know, stakeholders, or we have names here and there, but I think would be good to also rethink that. These names we are using in involving all the stakeholders, it's not enough. It's not enough. We are still within our own field. Anyway, sorry, it's too much, but I think it was wonderful, this discussion. So, yes.
Yeah, I don't know whether I mentioned it or not. I think I might have been using the phrase community engagement as opposed to collaboration. But one of the things that I said, and I'd just like to say more strongly now, is that a very important dynamic of collaboration is an examination of structures of power. And I can't help but think about what's going on in my country right now, which makes me very depressed. But I'm just trying to imagine the future, as we all are, through artistic interventions, through recognizing indigenous understandings of the world. And it just seems like that, these areas are a way forward in resistance to what's going on right now. And I'm not sure how it's going to happen, but I think we do just need to not only recognize and collaborate, but find ways to shift power to people and communities who've been out of power and have answers for us. And I'm at a loss to say how or how this is going to happen, but it's shaping in my mind right now, and in part in response to everything we're saying. So.